Long before the Bible was written, long before Moses walked the desert, there were clay tablets buried under the sands of Mesopotamia. They lay hidden for thousands of years, waiting for someone to uncover them. When archaeologists finally did, they realized they had stumbled upon something extraordinary: stories that sounded eerily familiar. Floods that wiped out humanity. A man chosen to survive. A serpent stealing immortality. A garden of the gods. This discovery shook the world of history and religion. Were the stories in the Bible completely original, or were they part of a much older tradition passed down from civilization to civilization? And if they came from somewhere else, what does that mean for everything we thought we knew? The Sumerians were one of the first great civilizations. They invented writing. They built cities, temples, irrigation systems, and they wrote a lot. Thousands of tablets filled with myths, laws, poems, even jokes. These weren't vague fragments. These were detailed narratives about gods, heroes, creation, and the destiny of mankind. And the deeper scholars dug, the more they noticed that these stories weren't just similar to the Bible, they sometimes matched it almost line for line. Take the flood story. In the book of Genesis, Noah builds an ark to save his family and animals from a divine flood meant to cleanse the earth. In the Sumerian story, later refined by the Babylonians, a man named Utnapishtim or Ziusudra in older versions is warned by a god about a coming flood. He too builds a massive boat. He too takes animals aboard. When the waters recede, he releases birds to find dry land. The parallels are too many to ignore, but here is where it gets fascinating. The Sumerian tablets are older by more than 1,000 years, which raises the question: did the biblical writers borrow these stories, reshape them, and give them a new theological meaning? Or is it possible that both Noah and Utnapishtim were based on a real event, an actual flood so devastating that it was remembered by different cultures across time? And the tablets don't stop there. They describe the creation of mankind from clay, not unlike Adam being formed from the dust of the ground. They speak of a paradise-like garden where humans lived in harmony until something went wrong. They even tell of a serpent that brought death and denied humanity eternal life. How could a culture from thousands of years before the Bible tell stories so similar to the ones millions of people still read today? Some scholars argue that these parallels show how connected the ancient world really was. Ideas, myths, and traditions didn't stay in one place. Traders, travelers, and conquerors spread them across lands, where they were reshaped to fit local culture and faith. By the time Hebrew scribes began writing the Old Testament, these myths were already part of the shared memory of the Near East. Others suggest something even deeper, that maybe these stories all come from a single, ancient event. Perhaps there really was a cataclysm, a great flood at the end of the last ice age when melting glaciers raised sea levels and wiped out coastal settlements. If that happened, it might have been so traumatic that every early civilization preserved the memory in its own way. But the most provocative idea is this: what if the Sumerians were not just telling myths, but recording history as they understood it? Their tablets don't read like simple folktales. They often include lists of kings, measurements of cities, precise numbers of years. If even part of what they wrote is true, then we are looking at a window into a world far older and more complex than we imagined. The story of the tablets versus the Bible is not just about which came first. It is about how humanity remembers. It is about what we choose to keep, what we choose to change, and what truths survive across millennia. And as more tablets are translated, more secrets are coming to light, some of them challenging everything we thought we knew about where our most sacred stories began. Asterisk. The parallels between the two traditions raise a question that scholars have debated for over a century. Did the authors of the Bible borrow from Sumerian sources? Or do both stories derive from a much older shared oral tradition? To answer that, researchers have dug deep into archaeological sites across Mesopotamia, finding thousands of cuneiform tablets, some of which predate the earliest Hebrew texts by more than 1,000 years. The Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians had a rich literary culture, and the Epic of Gilgamesh was part of a larger mythological framework that shaped the worldview of the ancient Near East. The flood story appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts, including the Atrahasis epic, which was composed centuries before Gilgamesh was standardized. Atrahasis is even closer to the Noah narrative in many respects, describing how the gods sent a flood to wipe out humanity, but one man was warned to build a massive boat, bring animals, and survive. The Hebrew Bible, on the other hand, situates its flood story within a moral and theological framework. In Genesis, the flood is not simply the result of noisy or overpopulated humans disturbing the gods. It is a direct judgment by one just God against a corrupt and violent world. This shift is significant, and many scholars argue that even if the Hebrew authors were aware of Mesopotamian stories, they reinterpreted them through their own religious lens, turning a regional myth into a moral narrative about divine justice. The question of influence is not only literary but also cultural. The Hebrew people spent time in Mesopotamia, both historically and mythologically. Abraham, the patriarch of Israel, is said to have come from Ur of the Chaldees, the city in southern Mesopotamia. Later, the Babylonian exile brought Jewish leaders into direct contact with Mesopotamian traditions. It is very plausible that stories like the flood would have been known and retold, eventually shaping the Genesis account. But there is also the argument for independent origin. Flood stories appear all over the world, from India to China, from Native American tribes to Pacific Islanders. Could it be that these myths reflect a distant memory of a real, catastrophic flood event, perhaps at the end of the last ice age when rising sea levels submerged vast coastal plains? Some geologists point to the flooding of the Black Sea or the rapid melting of ice sheets around 12,000 years ago as possible candidates. If so, the Mesopotamian and Hebrew flood stories might not be about borrowing, but about remembering the versions of the same prehistoric disaster passed down through different cultures. The tablets and the Bible also differ in tone. The Sumerian and Akkadian texts often portray the gods as capricious, even petty. In Atrahasis, the gods send the flood because humans are too noisy, disturbing their sleep. Afterward, the gods regret their decision, hungry because there are no humans left to offer sacrifices. In contrast, the God of Genesis is deliberate, purposeful, and not dependent on humanity. He is sorrowful over the state of the world but offers a promise never to destroy it in this way again. This theological evolution is profound. It marks a move toward monotheism and a more personal, covenantal relationship between deity and humanity. Even the boats are described differently. Utnapishtim's vessel in Gilgamesh is an enormous cube, with equal length, width, and height, made of wood and bitumen. Noah's Ark is described as a long rectangular box with precise measurements. Some researchers argue that the biblical version is more seaworthy, suggesting that the authors may have had practical knowledge of shipbuilding that the Mesopotamian writers lacked, or that they simply imagine a more realistic design. The conversation about which came first also touches on the nature of sacred texts. If the Hebrew authors drew from Mesopotamian sources, does that diminish the Bible's authority? Many theologians argue the opposite, that the biblical writers took common ancient stories and infused them with a unique vision of justice, morality, and faith. In this view, Genesis is not just a copy but a transformation, elevating a myth into a story about human responsibility and divine purpose. The debate continues, and new discoveries still surface. Every year archaeologists unearth new tablets, some fragmentary, some surprisingly intact. Each one has the potential to shed light on how these stories evolved. The more we find, the more we see that the ancient world was interconnected, with ideas traveling along trade routes, shared around campfires, and inscribed into clay for future generations. When we compare the Bible and the Sumerian tablets, we are not just looking for who told the story first. We are exploring how humanity has always tried to make sense of catastrophe, survival, and the meaning of life. Whether you see these stories as history, myth, or something in between, they connect us to our ancestors and to the timeless questions they faced. As we reach the end of this exploration, one thing becomes clear: the story of the Great Flood is not simply about ancient texts competing for originality. It is about how cultures across time have sought to explain the human condition, to answer why suffering exists, and to find hope after devastation. The Sumerian tablets and the Bible may share a framework, but their messages diverge in profound ways. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, after the flood, Utnapishtim gains immortality but lives far away from humanity, cut off from ordinary life. The story reflects a kind of melancholy. Even survival does not undo the tragedy, and immortality is lonely. The gods remain distant, their motives often unfathomable. In Genesis, by contrast, The aftermath of the flood is framed by a promise, a covenant between God and humanity symbolized by the rainbow. It is a message that the world has a moral order, that destruction will not be the final word. This difference may explain why the Noah story continues to resonate so deeply, offering reassurance that chaos and judgment can give way to mercy and renewal. Some researchers even suggest that the flood narrative became a foundation for how later societies structured their moral codes. The idea that actions have consequences, that violence and corruption lead to judgment, and that redemption is possible. These themes ripple through centuries of literature, law, and religion. In this sense, whether the Bible borrowed from Mesopotamia becomes less important than how it reimagined the tale for a new generation. Modern science adds another layer. Studies of ancient climate events show that dramatic floods really did occur, river systems changing course, massive tsunamis wiping out coastal settlements, glacial lakes bursting and inundating valleys. These events would have left an unforgettable mark on early human memory. Oral traditions could have carried those memories for millennia before being written down in cuneiform or on parchment. It is entirely possible that both the Sumerian scribes and the Hebrew authors were preserving fragments of a real prehistoric disaster, not identical, but born from the same origin story. The fascination with these narratives has not faded. Museums display the tablets to crowds who marvel at the tiny wedge-shaped script. Scholars continue to translate new fragments, piecing together missing lines. And millions still read Genesis as sacred scripture, finding comfort in the idea that the world is guided by meaning rather than random chaos. Perhaps that is the most important takeaway. The question of who told the story first is compelling, but what really matters is why humanity keeps telling it. The flood story is not just about survival, it is about transformation. It reminds us that destruction can lead to renewal, that the world can be washed clean, that we can begin again, even today. In a world where rising seas and natural disasters dominate the headlines, the ancient stories feel strangely relevant. They urge us to think about how we live, how we treat each other, and what kind of future we want to build once the waters recede. The Sumerian Tablets give us a glimpse of the earliest attempts to put these questions into writing. The Bible offers a reinterpretation that still shapes moral and spiritual imagination today. Together they form a dialogue across time, inviting us to listen, to compare, and to reflect on what it means to be human in a fragile, ever-changing world. So when we ask who told the story first, maybe the better question is why the story still matters. It endures because it speaks to something deep inside us, our fear of losing everything, and our hope that after the flood, there will still be a tomorrow.